Hello, welcome back, everybody. So, last time we looked at the start of the French Revolution and some of the factors that led up to the French Revolution. And where we kind of left off is that we had this sense of a nation that had a strong divided class system. We had some geography factors, some historical factors, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the political. So when we looked at what had historically happened in France at the time, we had a system in which the estates were given one vote per estate. And with three estates and two of them typically aligned, always the third estate was sort of the one that did not have their voice heard. So this had come to a head when they had declared that they were going to form this National Assembly. We see the king try to lock them out. They find an open tennis court and they make an oath right then and there that they're not going to give up until they have what's called a constitution, which is a written document with rights for every citizen, no matter who they are. So out of this tennis court oath came what we call the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And within this document was the laying out of a foundation for basic rights for every person in the country. Now, was it really as egalitarian? No, because when they said the Declaration of the Rights of Man, they really meant it, because women at this time were still excluded. So it did have a lot of momentum in their rights, but it still wasn't quite the constitution that we now know in most countries that support democracy. However, in this big step forward for France at the time, they included things like a new vision for government. They wanted to protect people's rights. They wanted more equality. They wanted the state to represent individuality. They wanted to be able to own their own property and to have their own businesses and not to have the nobility come along and collect all of the money towards taxation and land dues. They wanted more press and freedom to express dissent, which is a difference in opinion against things like the monarchy, as well as excessive punishment. So there was a lot of suppression against people who might not agree with the monarch or perhaps the ruling of or decisions of King Louis XVI at the time. So this document was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and they had really kind of forced it upon the king that he was going to sign it. Now, King Louis at the time didn't take this document all too seriously. He thought that this would be something he would sign to appease this group of angry people, and then in his mind probably was going to go back in a short amount of time to ruling the way that they always had. However, the start of this document really led to a feverish movement upon the population in France at that time towards change, and they weren't going to go back. So they had a large following in this push for more equality. One of the keystone events that really symbolized the change in France and the falling of the monarchy officially was seen on the day that they stormed the Bastille. The Bastille, it was a place where the monarch had held a lot of their ammunition and their guns. It was almost a symbol for their power, and it would be a place that would store prisoners who would speak out against the monarchy. So the Bastille, on top of having weapons that they needed if you want to have a revolution and change, they needed to also have the weapons, but it was symbolic. It was a symbol of the king, and this was the place that they were going to go and storm. They still celebrate Bastille Day in France on July 14th. And it is seen still as a celebration and a liberation. It was people seeking freedom. It was the day that they were free, and this was kind of seen as the proper start of what we now know as the French Revolution. And, to remind you that King Louis did not live in France. Did not live in Paris. This is in Paris. And so he always had removed himself slightly outside of the city for physical separation, but it also kind of told the people that I am untouchable, I'm out here, and he was in the Palace of Versailles, which is slightly outside of that. So the intent was really to go and arm themselves with ammunition and guns and gunpowder, and then they would go and head off to the Palace of Versailles, where they were going to demand that King Louis and Marie Antoinette step down as leaders. So when the revolution started within France, and it started with the Bastille, and then they were going to storm, Versailles, and they were going to demand that King Louis and Marie Antoinette leave the palace, and they were going to be held as prisoners to much resistance, but eventually they did. The outside reaction from people outside was not in support, because if, let's say, a monarch is able to be taken down in France, what happens to the neighboring countries? So the countries around had sent troops and forces and money and ammunition to try to squash this nationalist movement. And of course, this created more divide as the countries were now, this almost united France. They had a purpose and a goal, and they kind of saw themselves as fighting for something. But it did not mean that this movement was accepted by the countries around them, and they were going to fear the same thing. So if they were going to take down their monarch and they were going to attack the king, these started to kind of get worried in the countries around them. This time period afterwards was called the Reign of Terror, and actually what started to happen was people at the time under the rule of King Louis and Marie Antoinette were not allowed to express any sort of dissent or any sort of disagreement towards the monarchy. You were not allowed. You would have been thrown into the Bastille, the key would have been thrown away, your family would have been put in jail. And then we see this movement towards people who are going to punish those who spoke against the revolution. And so the revolution almost kind of turned on its head in a way, because not only now, if you didn't support the revolution and you supported perhaps some sense of respect towards the monarch, you could have been killed. You were called a traitor. You were put into the guillotine. Oftentimes, these murders were very public, and they were subjected to the guillotine in a way of a public demonstration. It was a message to tell others that if you do not support the idea of a revolution, and you do not support the idea of freedom and movement away from the monarch, you are the enemy. And this large time period, a lot of people were put under the guillotine and killed who were speaking out against the revolution. And that time period was called the Reign of Terror. So this left a large gap open for leadership in the country. The large problem with the revolution is they knew what they didn't want, and that was a continuation of a monarch and somebody who was born into the role and didn't necessarily have the citizens' interests, but they also didn't have a plan for a strong leader in place. So the problem in France at that time was there was a lack of leadership. And what ended up happening was we see the rise of this young, he was an army leader. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. And so we're going to see him come into power, and we're going to follow kind of how he also instilled a sense of nationalism. And he was a very controversial figure as well. He made a lot of changes to France, which we're going to explore. But really what happened after France, they had a very tumultuous time period in which they had a lot of unrest among citizens and leaders. And so they had a individual step up who had a strong sense of vision for the country, and the country was craving a strong leader. So Napoleon comes up, and we're going to look at Napoleon next lesson.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website online.plrd.ab.ca and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.